born in 1933, which was the worst year of the Great Depression. And fewer people, Americans, were born in 1933 on a per capita basis than any year in our history. So I always felt very lucky, as did my wife Rosalie, that we got born that year, because not very many of us did get born. But when I first saw that there was something different and heart-wrenching was when people would come to our back door asking for food, asking for something to eat. And we lived in a house that was right off what we used to be called the Lincoln Highway, which is one of the main roads from east to west. And if you were a house that would give out food, the people who came by to get the food would mark some post or something in the vicinity that you were a good place to stop and ask for food. So we were on the list, as it were. And I remember my mother would always insist that they sit on the back porch, and after they were fed something, that the plates and the cups and everything else were boiled, because in that day, contagious diseases were a very serious problem. And so she didn't want to have any risk about that.
Yeah.
But I remember also being in downtown Pittsburgh with my mother one time, and there was a man leaning over a garbage pail in an alley. And I asked what he was doing, and she said he's looking for something to eat. And I've never, ever forgotten that.
How did your family manage in those times?
My family managed because my father worked with his father in the family business, the McCullough Electric Company, and they were not letting any of their people go, and of course they weren't letting members of the family go. So our family was very fortunate in that nobody had any fear that my father was going to be fired or lose his job or anything like that. But my father later told me that one of his best friends, who lived just 2 houses down from us, came to him one night asking if he could please have a loaf of bread for his family. It was very, very serious and very important event. And my father never got over it. And he used to say, it's going to come again. It's going to come again. It's going to happen again. And you had to be prepared for this. It's going to come again. It'll be again. It'll be bad enough to curl your hair. And fortunately, he was wrong. It never did come. People who were young couples with young families and getting started, which he was then, it was an experience they never forgot. And they had 2 of these experiences in effect, one right after the other. The Depression followed by World War II, the worst war ever in history.
Yeah.
So the worst Depression and then the worst war. And sometimes people will say, oh, you have to remember that was a simpler time back then. No, it never was a simpler time. In fact, the case could be made that it was a more difficult time than we've ever been through.
What were the meals for, what did most people eat during those times in your family?
Well, it's very hard for me to answer from direct experience.
Yeah.
Because we sensed no difference whatsoever.
Yeah.
Because we were lucky, my father had a job.
Yeah.
And in some ways, for anyone who had a job, it was a good time because everything was so inexpensive.
Yeah.
So that you might not have a very high salary, but the cost of living was so very low that your money went farther if you had a regular income.
Yeah.
But there were no we always ate leftovers. You never threw anything away.
Yeah.
You knew, because the implications were there, of how much things cost. So if you had boiled ham, let's say, for dinner, or a turkey, or roast beef or something, you knew that was a high occasion. One of the favorite dinners in our family was what's called chipped beef. I don't even know the makers sell chipped beef today. You never hear of it. I loved it. I thought it was one of my favorite things to eat. And dinner, and I think this is an important difference between then and now. Dinner was a required appearance in a family. You sat down with the whole family at dinner every night, and you talked about what happened during the day, and you were expected to be there at the dinner table. You were expected to have good manners. You were expected to be respectful to your mother and father and your grandmother and so forth. And my father and my grandmother, my mother's mother, would get into ardent arguments about politics. And my father was against Franklin Roosevelt. My grandmother thought that except for Jesus Christ, nobody ever on earth was ever so close to being a deity, a godlike figure as Franklin Roosevelt. So they would get in very emotional arguments. But the thing that made them so memorable was that both of them were extremely hard of hearing. So I learned all about the difference between Republicans and Democrats at a very high decibel level. They were shouting at each other. But to my father's credit, he was always respectful to my dear grandmother, Rankin, and his mother-in-law. But I think that in many ways, I and my brothers all learned as much or more at the dinner table every night as we did in school. Because, and I think where my interest in history began there, because my father, my mother, my grandmother would start talking about things that had happened in their lifetime or before in Pittsburgh. The floods, the fires, the strikes, and the eccentric characters in the family, and how weird they were, and I loved that part of it. You know, old Uncle Fred or something. It was strange, and so that's very much connected to my memory of dinner table food.
Describe your family size, wealth, and...
Well, I have 4 brothers.
Yeah.
Mother, father. My father's income was probably somewhere around $8,000 to $10,000 a year, which was a lot of money.
Yeah.
Also, they had built their house about 1928 or 29, and my father didn't want to borrow money about it, so he took all of his savings and put them into the house. So when the stock market crashed, he didn't lose anything.
Yeah.
And the feelings with so many people was, it's rising, it'll keep on rising. If you're in debt, put more money into the stock market. That wasn't what he did. So he was very lucky in that respect.
Yeah.
But there's certain things that were different that today most people wouldn't even understand. If your stocking got a hole in it, my mother would darn that hole, darning stocking.
Yeah.
Today people just throw it out.
You couldn't wear the socks.
And you couldn't wear the socks. Because if your mother wasn't very good at darning, they put a big lump in the heel or wherever it was, but she had to wear it.
Yeah.
You always had to move into the clothing that your older brother had, so you were wearing hand-me-down clothing from your older brothers or your older sister. But that was true of people who had what we call middle incomes today, as it was with people who had less than that.
Yeah.
Also, I lived in a neighborhood where there was a big mix of people. It was not limited to only wealthy people or only middle income people or only poor people. Poor people lived right around the corner. The zoning was such that it was a wonderful mix. And I grew up with Czechoslovakian fellow classmates and Jewish classmates and Hungarians. And when you got on the streetcar, you heard 2 or 3 different languages being spoken. There were 2 or 3 different newspapers in 2 or 3 different languages being read on the paper. So years later, when people started talking about diversity, I thought, well, what's new about that? Because it was a manufacturing, big industrial city that had brought in all kinds of immigrants to work in the mills.
Yeah.
And they were part of the world that I grew up in.
Yeah. Well, how was culture and music and sports?
Well, wonderful. And I would say emblematic of all this was the Carnegie Library, Carnegie Institute, Carnegie Concert Hall. The library, the art gallery, the Natural History Museum, and the concert hall were all under the same roof. And so when you went down to the library, you could go in and look at dinosaur bones, or you could go upstairs and see paintings, or you could go down the hall and hear somebody singing. And so I never had this sense that there was any separation from all of that. It was all part of the wonderful, creative reaches of the human mind. The sports were an avid part of life in Pittsburgh, professional sports, as they are still,
Yeah.
with the Steelers and the Pirates baseball team and all that. The Pittsburgh Symphony was fabulous. The Dixieland Jazz, which was a big thing at the time, was very prominent. I would say that culturally, for what many people in the rest of the country would have thought of as nothing but an overgrown mill town, that Pittsburgh was right there with the best of them.
Yeah.
And with people who became important culturally, intellectually, and in the arts to the whole country. Writers and sculptors and painters and musicians. I consider myself extremely lucky that I grew up when I did and where I did. And I think it was a very realistic time in many ways for kids.
Wind up
Thank you
last
so
one.
much for letting me interview.
Walker, I'm very glad to